Apparently, I committed a crime by sitting on my own porch with a cup of coffee. That's what she said, clipboard in one hand, heels sinking into my gravel driveway, pointing at my dock like it was some kind of illegal structure smuggled in under the cover of night. What she didn't know, I didn't just own the porch. I didn't just own the dock. I owned her lawn, her swing set, and half the community center she held HOA meetings in. And by the end of this story, so will you. This is not just a battle over paint color and lawn codes. This is the true, outrageous, ridiculous story of how a woman tried to evict me from my own land and ended up dismantling her entire kingdom in the process. And hey, if you've ever had to deal with a power-hungry HOA, or if you just wish you could tell your neighborhood Karen to get off your lawn, drop your story in the comments, because you're not alone. And this is how you fight back with maps, receipts, and a whole lot of sarcasm. Buckle up. The dock war starts now. There are few things in life that still feel real these days. Bank statements are digital. Friendships are algorithmic. Even the coffee I drink comes in biodegradable pods now, with branding that sounds like therapy slogans. But there's one thing that stayed gloriously analog in my life, mornings on the porch, alone, with a mug of black coffee and no one telling me what shade of beige my fence needs to be. At least, that was the idea. The morning it all began was quiet. The kind of stillness you only get by living on a lake that hasn't been swallowed by developers and yoga retreats. Birds chirping, water gently tapping against the dock my grandfather built with his bare hands in the 60s, and me, sitting in a folding chair that probably violated 10 ordinances just by existing, wearing socks with holes and a flannel shirt older than some of the nearby residents' kids. Then came the clicking, not of birds or crickets, but of cheap high heels on gravel. I looked up to see a woman marching down my driveway like she was seizing a hostile embassy. Rhinestone-covered tank top that said CEO of everything, sunglasses too large for her face, and a clipboard raised like a judge's gavel. I didn't know it yet, but I was staring at the most powerful tyrant in a 5-mile radius, Karen Whitlock, president of the Pine Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. "You must be Caleb Monroe," she said, in a tone usually reserved for defendants in custody. "I must be," I replied, sipping my coffee. She looked around with dramatic distaste, pausing at the dock. "That structure is non-compliant." She said it the way some people say tumor. I blinked. My grandfather built that dock in 1967. Karen pulled out a glossy pamphlet full of color charts, legalese, and architectural renderings that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a grudge against joy. Well, our committee didn't approve it. I took another sip. "I don't think your committee existed when Nixon was in office." Karen didn't laugh. She wasn't the laughing type. The clipboard came up again. "You'll want to review our community standards. The dock isn't the only issue. Your landscaping is irregular. The cabin's exterior paint is outside the approved palette. And your porch furniture, let's just say it lacks visual harmony." She handed me a thick packet of bylaws and guidelines, bound like a doctoral thesis. Then she smiled a kind of forced, stretched smile that made me feel like I was about to be mugged by legislation. "You have 30 days to bring everything into compliance. Otherwise, fines will be assessed." Behind her were two others silent, awkward, clearly HOA underlings who weren't as sure about this mission. One of them gave me a sheepish half-wave. The other kept looking at her watch, probably counting the minutes until they could escape this HOA SWAT raid. Karen gestured grandly around the property, as though she were Caesar surveying Gaul. "We all want to maintain property values. Mr. Monroe, cooperation is key." And then she left. Just like that. Clipboard clutched to her chest, heels crunching back up the driveway, leaving the faint smell of perfume and misplaced authority. Now, I'm not a confrontational guy. I've spent most of my life in environmental work, surveying wetlands and avoiding people. But something about this woman strutting onto my property, insulting my grandfather's dock, and threatening fines for non-harmonious porch furniture, it stirred something primal in me. I went inside and pulled out the manila folder my grandfather left behind. I hadn't looked at it in months, not since I moved into the cabin after his passing. I figured it was old tax stuff or warranty manuals for appliances that hadn't worked since Reagan. Inside was the deed, signed, notarized, and dated 1965. The land had been in our family for nearly 60 years. Not only that, but it clearly outlined the property boundaries 3 acres, wrapping around the curve of the lake like a gentle hook. The dock firmly within those lines, the land predating the entire Pine Hollow Estates development by decades. Tucked into the back of the folder was an envelope, sealed, on the front, in my grandfather's firm handwriting. Open this if anyone tries to pull some nonsense. I opened it. Inside were more documents, surveys, permits, even a faded map with hand-drawn notes and a short letter. If someone shows up talking about community rules, tell them to take it up with the 1965 Zoning Commission. Everything's filed with the county. This land's ours. Always has been. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The next day, I walked over to visit Dorothy Weatherby, our neighbor 3 doors down, unofficial historian, and the only person over 60 I know who uses a tablet more efficiently than most teenagers. She listened patiently as I described the encounter. Then she sipped her tea and said, "That woman has been terrorizing this place ever since she got divorced and discovered the power of Robert's Rules of Order." Dorothy had been around since before Pine Hollow was Pine Hollow. She remembered when the development was just a proposal and a few surveyors traipsing through the woods. She also remembered, very clearly, that my grandfather's land was excluded from the HOA boundaries. "She can't touch your property," she said, "but she'll sure try." She recommended I visit the county recorder's office and get the official maps. Documentation. Caleb, that's your sword and shield. So, that Monday, I drove into town, past the gas station where the locals still know how to fix a carburetor, and walked into the county building, an unremarkable structure with air conditioning set to Arctic and a faint smell of burnt toner. The clerk, Evelyn, was one of those bureaucrats you pray for in times of legal fog. Efficient, curious, and more than happy to help unravel a mystery. "Oh, a property boundary case," she said, eyes lighting up. "Those are my favorite." 30 minutes later, we had the full plot map pulled up, old survey scans digitized, and the deed history laid out in clean, bureaucratic precision. Evelyn pointed to the screen. "See here, your property wraps all the way along the lakefront, including that area labeled as Community Dock on their HOA map. That's my dock. That's your everything," she said, tapping the screen. The reality sank in like a sunrise. I didn't just own the cabin. I owned the land under the dock, the path behind it, and according to these documents, part of what the HOA claimed was shared green space, back home. I sat on the dock with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the sun bounce off the water. A pontoon boat passed by, probably from one of the McMansions further down the shoreline. For a moment, I felt nothing but peace. And then I saw it pinned to my front door. A violation notice, bold letters, official seal, 3 citations, unauthorized dock, non-compliant paint, and improper landscaping. A fine of $500 escalating in 15 days. I took it down, walked back inside, sat at my desk, and I smiled. Karen had no idea what she'd stepped into. This wasn't just a dock. This was war. Karen wasn't the kind of woman to take quiet offense. She didn't just get mad, she mobilized. 2 days after the clipboard confrontation, I found a letter in my mailbox that looked like it had been drafted by a team of over-caffeinated paralegals. It was typed, watermarked, and stamped in bright red with the words, "Notice of violation, final warning before enforcement proceedings." The charges: 1. Unauthorized dock structure. 2. Non-compliant exterior color. 3. Failure to maintain landscaping according to Section 4, 2 of the Pine Hollow Visual Uniformity Code. They even included a deadline 15 days to comply or face daily fines of $50 up to $5,000 total, and possible legal action for willful non-compliance. It read like a subpoena, but smelled like desperation. Attached was a letter from Peter T. Hollingsworth, HOA legal counsel who, upon further Googling, turned out to be an estate lawyer who mostly handled wills and hadn't seen a courtroom since Y2K. Still, the letter had enough boilerplate language to sound scary to most folks. But here's where things got interesting. There was one phrase that made my blood run hotter than my coffee. As this property falls within the established governance perimeter of the Pine Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, all structures and exterior modifications must receive approval from the Architectural Review Committee, per Article 3, Section 7 of the Community Covenant, adopted in 2018. That was the key. Because my grandfather bought this land in 1965 and I had the original deed, the permits, and the surveyed property lines to prove it. So how could a legal structure approved by the county and built 50+ years prior suddenly be declared illegal by a committee that didn't even exist until the iPhone X came out? It couldn't, at least not legally. Law reference number 1, Common Interest Development Law, California, Civil Code, Borough 4,000 6150. No association shall enforce any new architectural or landscaping standard retroactively upon a property not previously subject to the recorded declaration at the time of its purchase or development. Translation: if your land wasn't under the HOA when it was developed, the HOA can't come in later and make up rules for you. Even in other states like Texas, Florida, or North Carolina, HOA jurisdiction depends on consensual inclusion via deed restriction or voluntary agreement. No such document existed in my case. Karen was bluffing, badly. Still, bluffing can work if your opponent folds. Most people do. That's the trick of HOA overreach. Use the illusion of authority, backed by paperwork and fear, and people fall in line. But I wasn't people. I had a land survey, a county seal, and an old man's stubbornness coursing through my veins. But I needed more. So I dug. For the next 2 days, I did what Karen never expected. I actually read all 142 pages of the Pine Hollow Estates HOA covenant. I cross-checked parcel maps on the county GIS system. I matched it with title transfers, zoning overlays, and land use files dating back to 1960. That's when I noticed something off. The HOA's perimeter map included several parcels that clearly predated the development, and not just mine. There were 2 other properties on the same side of the lake, older cabins with long-standing ownership histories. Yet they were listed as within HOA jurisdiction in recent filings, which is impossible. Law reference number 2, Zoning Law and Precedent Title, Rights General Principle in Real Property. Law, zoning authority, and community covenants cannot override pre-existing fee, simple ownership, absent voluntary annexation, or clear deed restrictions. Translation: unless the owner agreed to join the HOA or signed something saying, yes, I'm under your thumb, the HOA has no legal say. And guess what? Neither I nor my grandfather ever signed anything. The more I looked, the more it stank of misrepresentation, or worse, fraud. Either Karen didn't understand the limits of her power, or she was deliberately pretending the HOA had more authority than it legally did. I needed confirmation. Dorothy was already suspicious, so I walked over with a printout of the parcel timeline and boundary overlays. She glanced over the map, then at me. Well, Caleb, you're not just right. You're probably the only person who's ever looked at this closely. She sipped her tea again. They've been bluffing their way through this neighborhood for years. People are too busy to fight back, or too scared. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me. It was about power, and how easily it becomes abusive when no one questions it. Karen didn't hold power because she had legal authority. She held power because no one challenged her. And it was time someone did. I started documenting everything: violation notices, voicemails, emails from the HOA compliance officer, even a neighbor who said Karen had warned her that Caleb was refusing to follow neighborhood law. That's not a phrase. By the way, neighborhood law isn't a real thing. It's like saying recycling tax or emotional speed limit. Sounds official, means nothing. Law reference number 3, Florida statute, but first 720. 30301. The powers of a homeowners association are limited to those expressly granted in the declaration and may not override deeded property rights or publicly recorded land use. This is true in most states. HOA cannot enforce their rules outside the declared, legally recorded boundaries. I scheduled a trip to the Millbrook County Recorder's office. There, Evelyn the clerk remembered me. She was more than happy to help pull the archived records and GIS overlays. Together, we compared the original survey submitted by my grandfather's engineer to the HOA's current claims. The result, my property legally surveyed and filed in 1965, included the dock and shoreline where Karen claimed community rules applied, a forested buffer area the HOA designated as community easement, and, most hilariously, 60% of the HOA's so-called shared green space. That meant they were trespassing, not me. Law reference number 4, trespass, law, civil code. Paragraph 841, California, or similar nationwide, entering or using land without the owner's permission, even under a mistaken belief of ownership, constitutes civil trespass, meaning every HOA meeting in that park, every HOA-funded grill station installed on that lawn, every community event that took place there, all of it happened on my land. And here they were, fining me. I drove home in silence, heart pounding not from fear anymore, but something close to glee. I didn't just have a case. I had a gold mine of legal leverage. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something else, a second violation letter, taped to my door. This one upped the fine to $1,000 and warned of imminent legal escalation. Karen wasn't backing off. In fact, she was doubling down. And that's when I knew something dangerous. She had no idea what I now knew. This wasn't going to be a quiet disagreement over grass height anymore. This was going to be a war over truth, law, and who actually owned this lakeside kingdom. And for once, the guy with the flannel shirt and greasy coffee mug was the one holding the legal sword. There's a special kind of person who cannot back down even when they're objectively, legally, and cosmically wrong. Show them the facts, they double down. Read them the law, they call it fake news. Hand them proof with official stamps and notarized signatures, and they wave it away like a gnat interrupting their glass of boxed wine. Karen Whitlock was that kind of person. After I confirmed beyond any bureaucratic doubt that I legally owned not just my cabin and dock, but significant portions of what the HOA claimed as their sacred communal grounds, I thought maybe, just maybe, the storm would pass. I'd imagined a begrudging apology, perhaps a retraction of the fines, and then the HOA slinking off to argue about mulch uniformity with someone else. Instead, Karen declared war. It began innocently enough, a few sternly worded emails, passive-aggressive flyers taped to community mailboxes with bolded phrases like, "Certain residents believe they are above the law, and our lakefront is under attack." But within a week, she escalated. She launched what she called the Community Property Patrol, now, to the untrained eye. This looked like 3 middle-aged residents in matching neon orange t-shirts, patrolling on golf carts and snapping photos of my cabin from every possible angle. But, to Karen, this was a tactical operation. They set up lawn chairs just off the property line well. What they thought was the line, but was, in fact, a full 20 feet into my land and sat there in shifts like Cold War border guards. At first, it was funny. I'd wave to them from my porch, coffee in hand, wearing the same flannel shirt and a smirk. They didn't wave back. Then came the noise. Karen installed a motion-activated alarm along what she claimed was the eastern community border, which beeped every time a squirrel crossed the path. At night, they used flashlights to scan the dock area. They filmed my guests. One of them even placed a handwritten sign that read, "Under surveillance, HOA will prosecute trespassers." I took a photo of the sign. I was the trespasser, apparently, on my own property. But then it stopped being funny. Karen started filing formal complaints, lots of them. She sent letters to the Department of Natural Resources, claiming that I was dumping chemicals into the lake. She contacted the county fire marshal, stating she'd seen unregulated combustion activity on my fire pit. She even filed an anonymous tip with the Internal Revenue Service, suggesting that I might be profiting from unlicensed short-term rentals. I found out because government letters started arriving. Not citations, just inquiries, requests for clarification. Investigations launched, none sustained, but enough to waste my time, fray my nerves, and force me into a cycle of constant rebuttal. Iloa, OAD, reference number 1, false reporting, 18 U.S., Code Paragraph 1001. Knowingly and willfully making false or fraudulent statements to any department or agency of the United States is a federal crime. What Karen was doing, it wasn't just annoying, it was illegal, even at the state level. Her actions walked a fine legal line. Under California Penal Code, Paragraph 148.5, for instance, filing a knowingly false report to authorities is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail. Other states, like Florida and Texas, have similar statutes. Still, I kept calm, and I started documenting. Every phone call, every email, every complaint filed. I installed security cameras, high resolution, night vision, motion triggered. I bought a trail cam to watch the dock. And sure enough, the footage started piling up. Karen wasn't just filing reports, she was trespassing, multiple times. I caught her walking onto my property at night, holding a clipboard, flashlight, and occasionally a camera on a tripod. At one point, she even tried to measure the distance between my porch and the shoreline using a contractor's tape. Law reference number 2, civil harassment, California Code of Civil Procedure, Paragraph 527.6. Harassment is unlawful violence, a credible threat of violence, or a knowing and willful course of conduct that seriously alarms, annoys, or harasses another person and serves no legitimate purpose. Her actions were textbook harassment, especially when the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property to begin with. But Karen wasn't acting alone anymore. She'd begun to recruit. Dorothy, ever the neighborhood oracle, warned me that Karen had been knocking on doors, rallying residents with stories ranging from Caleb is planning to sell the dock to a developer to he's building a compound for eco-terrorists. One rumor claimed I had inherited the land through fraud. Another said I was secretly a lawyer for big government. None of it made sense. All of it was effective. A few neighbors stopped waving. One canceled plans for dinner. Another muttered something about property values when we passed each other on the trail. Karen, like all good propagandists, understood that truth was optional. What mattered was momentum. But she made one mistake: she targeted the wrong person. My background in environmental law wasn't just for show. I understood boundaries, legal and ecological. I also knew that if I let this continue, she'd eventually push things too far. And then she did. One night, I came home to find traffic cones blocking my driveway. A new sign had been posted, this one, reading pending HOA dispute, access restricted by order of committee. Committee. What committee? I removed the cones, took photos, and called the sheriff's department. When the deputy arrived, he looked at the sign, then at me, and sighed. HOA trouble, he asked. I nodded. I see this more often than you'd believe, he said. They think they're mini-governments, but they forget they don't make law. They enforce contracts. And if your land isn't under their authority, they've got no power here. He filed an incident report. I filed a formal complaint. Law reference number 3, HOA. Authority limits, general rule and real property law. An HOA's authority is limited to the properties subject to its declaration. It cannot impose rules or restrictions on properties that were never annexed into the HOA via deed or recorded agreement. Karen was in violation of that principle 10 different ways. But she wasn't done. I woke up one morning to find my mailbox stuffed with anonymous flyers titled, "Warning Dangerous Individual in Our Community," complete with an unflattering photo of me taken from a distance with a telephoto lens and a list of fabricated allegations. Tampering with HOA files, hosting unlicensed events, even aggressive staring. She was unraveling, and that's when I realized I wasn't the first. Dorothy sat me down one evening, poured me a glass of sweet tea, and told me the story. 2 years ago, a retired couple named the Bennetts tried to repaint their home a soft shade of yellow. Karen fined them $100 per day until they sold the house. A single mother had once parked a canoe too close to the curb. Karen towed it and fined her for storage. Most people just caved. You, Dorothy said, are the first one to actually fight back with facts. And she's terrified. I nodded slowly. She should be. Because while she was calling agencies and gossiping with half the town, I'd been meeting with a lawyer. His name was Daniel Park, mid-40s, sharp as a tack, and he specialized in land disputes and HOA litigation. I handed him the file I'd been compiling for weeks. Deed records, maps, letters, flyers, and surveillance footage. He flipped through it slowly, nodded, and said the words I'd been waiting to hear. You have a rock-solid civil harassment case, possibly even criminal charges if this escalates. Law reference number 4. Civil Harassment Restraining Order, CCP, Par 527-6, BTCs. There are 3. Unlawful harassment includes a course of conduct directed at a specific person that causes substantial emotional distress and serves no legitimate purpose. Daniel drafted the first cease and desist letter within 48 hours. We had evidence. We had motive. We had a clear timeline of misconduct. And more importantly, we had the law. If Karen's gossip campaign was warfare, then it was loud, erratic, and dependent entirely on misinformation. I, on the other hand, was building a missile, not a literal one. Of course, I'm not that kind of ex-hydrologist, but what I had in mind would cause just as much destruction to her paper-thin empire. I called in Leroy Jameson. Leroy was a professional land surveyor who had been measuring dirt for nearly 40 years and had seen every kind of property dispute known to man boundary squabbles between feuding farmers, subdivisions built over graveyards, driveways that mysteriously shifted 10 feet over generations. The guy had the gravelly voice of a lifelong smoker and the calm energy of someone who could outpatience a tree. He pulled into my driveway in a dusty old pickup that rattled like a coffee can full of screws and stepped out with a steel measuring wheel, a high-end GPS unit, and a weathered leather case full of survey maps older than my cabin. You weren't kidding, he muttered, staring down at the HOA's glossy subdivision map. These people built an entire fantasy on bad measurements. For 3 days, Leroy and his assistant Tommy walked, measured, dug, and beeped their way across the property. They found iron rods my grandfather's original surveyor had buried in 1965, still exactly where they were supposed to be. They took soil cores. They traced tree lines and shoreline erosion. They climbed through brush and laughed at the community access path sign staked directly in the middle of my legally recorded backyard. By the end of the 3rd day, Leroy called me over to the tailgate of his truck. He opened his laptop, tapped a few keys, and spun the screen around. There, he said, pointing. On the screen was a satellite image of the entire neighborhood, overlaid with GPS-verified boundary lines based on the original deed. The thick green outline was my property. Inside that green shape solidly, indisputably, was not just my dock and cabin, but the HOA's community dock. The gravel pathway labeled Pine Hollow Commons Access Trail. The picnic area with 3 benches and a swing set, the outdoor grill station. And this was the kicker, the entire west wing of the HOA's official community center. I stared at the screen in stunned silence. They've been trespassing on you for years, Leroy said flatly. Probably didn't even know. Or maybe didn't care. I laughed. A long, hollow laugh. Because I finally understood the scale of the absurdity. Not only was I not in violation of any HOA rules they were violating me, and not just casually, but in full-blown public beer-sipping, potluck-hosting fashion. I asked Leroy for a printed report, maps, and high-res copies. He nodded, promised me a full packet in 2 days, and packed up his equipment with the same quiet efficiency of someone who just watched a very predictable train wreck unfold in slow motion. That night, I called Dorothy. Let me guess, she said. They built half their kingdom on your land. 60%, I replied, including their private community dock. There was silence on the line, followed by a wheezing laugh that nearly broke her phone's speaker. Oh, honey, she said, I hope you recorded Karen's last speech about protecting what belongs to all of us. 2 days later, I sent Karen a letter, not an email, not a text, A good, old-fashioned certified letter, signed and delivered, with a return receipt requested. Inside, it was a single sentence and a flash drive. Attached is a professional survey of my property. I hereby request that the HOA cease all use of any structures, pathways, or facilities located on my land within 48 hours and provide written acknowledgement of such within 10 business days. Failure to comply will result in legal action. No threats, no insults, just facts. But I knew Karen wouldn't take it well. She didn't. 6 hours later, I received a barrage of voicemails, some frantic, some smug, some sounding like she'd had 2 glasses of box Chardonnay before hitting record. The flash drive manipulated, the survey bogus. My claim un-American. Yes. She said that. Then, the HOA called an emergency board meeting. Not a public one, an internal closed-door session, which I heard about only because Dorothy's nephew, Chester, happened to be on the maintenance committee. He called me right after. They're spiraling. He said, Karen's saying you forged the deed. One of the board members asked if they could call in the National Guard. She's not well. I replied, clearly, but Karen wasn't ready to give up. Oh no. The next day, she took it public. She marched from house to house with a packet she had printed at Staples, titled Community Under Siege, The Truth Behind the Monroe Land Grab. In it, she accused me of manipulating legal documents, trying to privatize the lake, endangering children by restricting access to recreational areas, and my favorite, attempting to dismantle the moral fabric of the neighborhood. The moral fabric. Because I didn't want strangers grilling hot dogs on my dock. By the weekend, Pine Hollow was divided into 3 camps. 1, Team Karen, who believed I was plotting to build a casino or a government surveillance station. 2, Team Caleb, who read the survey and realized, oh, this guy owns everything. 3, and Team I just want to water my plants in peace, who wish the drama would stop. But the most surprising shift came from the people in Camp 3. One by one, they started showing up at my porch. Quiet knocks, awkward introductions, offers to see the survey. Questions like, so, do we owe you rent for using the dock? I didn't hold grudges. I explained everything calmly, showed them the maps, reassured them that, no, I wasn't evicting children from the playground or installing a helipad. Most of them walked away grateful, some embarrassed, a few even angry at Karen. But she still wasn't done. One evening, Chester Davidson showed up with a warning. Chester was a contractor, blunt, practical, and not easily rattled. But he looked concerned. She's trying to hire a construction crew to renovate the dock. I overheard her on the phone with a guy from Lakeside Marine. She's telling them it's community property and authorizing $15,000 in upgrades. On my dock, I asked, yep. It was the moment the line got crossed, not just legally, but financially. Now, we weren't just dealing with delusions of authority. We were talking fraud. It was time to move. I called Daniel, my attorney. We gathered all the evidence, the survey, the deed history, the HOA's own misprinted maps, the flyers, the harassment, and now plans to spend HOA funds upgrading something they didn't own, and we prepared the lawsuit. But before we filed, I had one more play. A press release. Well, not a press release, per se, but a well-crafted, neatly typed letter sent to every homeowner in Pine Hollow, attached to a glossy, easy-to-read version of the survey map. It was direct, but civil, to my neighbors. This is the official, legally verified boundary of my property. Many features you've been told are part of the HOA are not. I will be working with my attorney to formalize this distinction and seek appropriate remedies. I understand the situation is frustrating. I'm not here to punish anyone, but I won't be bullied either. If you have questions, come talk to me directly. The truth is in the documentation. I signed it, dated it, mailed it. By Tuesday, Karen's world was burning. Some neighbors tore down the HOA signs overnight. Others confronted her during her morning walks. Chester texted me one sentence: Karen's been crying in her car for 20 minutes. I wasn't happy about it, but I wasn't sad either. Because for once, in a world full of gray zones and power games, truth had lines. Literal, measured, documented lines. and I had the map to prove it. The envelope arrived with a satisfying thud, thick, heavy, certified. Inside was the legal equivalent of a thunderclap, a cease and desist order, a notice of civil suit, and a formal complaint listing every instance of trespass, harassment, and misuse of HOA authority, since Karen Whitlock decided my lakeside property was her personal fiefdom. By the time it reached her, Karen had already been in damage control mode for days. The neighborhood had turned. People she once ruled with perfumed intimidation were now peeking behind the curtain, whispering about liability and embezzlement. And wait, she doesn't own that dock. She tried to hold a meeting at the community center, technically my community center now, but only 3 people showed up. One was her catty ally Janice. Another was her husband, who looked like he wanted to disappear. And the third was Chester Davidson, who came purely for the free lemonade and dramatic spectacle. Chester later told me that Karen spent most of the time pacing in front of a flip chart titled Counter-Offensive Plan. She listed things like discredit survey, contact local media, and my personal favorite, petition to redefine property boundaries via emergency vote. When he pointed out that votes don't override deeds, she screamed, "It's about the spirit of community." But by then, the community had largely chosen peace over spirit. So, when the lawsuit dropped, she did what all tyrants do. When cornered, she panicked. First, she tried to deny everything. Then, she blamed the developer. Then, she claimed the documents were faked. Then, beautifully, gloriously, she claimed I had hypnotized the neighborhood with psychological warfare. The trial was scheduled for early summer at the Millbrook County Courthouse, a modest building with squeaky chairs and a judge known for disliking nonsense. Her name was Judge Patricia Thornfield, and she ran her courtroom like a military base with slightly more floral decor. On the day of the hearing, Karen arrived in full theater designer sunglasses, pink blazer, 5-inch heels, and a rolling briefcase stuffed with color-coded tab dividers. I arrived in jeans, boots, and a binder held together with rubber bands. Daniel, my lawyer, wore a gray suit and an expression that said, "I'm about to enjoy this." Judge Thornfield opened with a look that could shatter granite. "This is a property rights case?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel replied. "And the defendant claims to own land she does not legally own." "Not quite," Daniel said. "She claims to enforce rules over land she does not own, control, lease, or have any contractual authority over." Karen stood up without being asked. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this man is trying to destroy the very soul of our community." Judge Thornfield stared at her for a full 5 seconds. "Sit down." What followed was the legal equivalent of a demolition. Daniel laid out the original deed from 1965, the survey from Leroy, the HOA maps, and every violation notice I had received. He presented emails from Karen that contradicted her public claims. He read aloud the HOA bylaws, none of which applied to properties outside the covenant. He showed the signed contract she'd attempted to issue for dock renovations using HOA funds. Karen attempted a rebuttal by presenting a Pinterest board, a neighborhood newsletter, and a voice recording that, as far as I could tell, captured nothing but wind and the distant sound of someone saying he's not very friendly. The judge closed her binder and sighed. "I have ruled on 57 property disputes in my time," she said, "and never once have I seen a case where one party so flagrantly ignored legal boundaries literally and figuratively." She turned to Karen. "You will cease all activity involving Mr. Monroe's land. You will remove all HOA signage, fixtures, and structures built upon his property within 30 days. You will personally pay damages in the amount of $15,000, plus attorney's fees." Karen opened her mouth. The judge raised a hand. "No further commentary. You may appeal, but I advise you to consider the cost. Case closed." Bang. Outside the courtroom, Daniel shook my hand. "That went better than expected. I feel like I just got my land baptized." I replied. Karen didn't speak to me as she left, but Chester sent me a text later that day with a blurry photo of her in the courthouse parking lot, dramatically tearing papers in front of her car while her husband quietly tried to collect the pieces. Over the next month, the fallout came swiftly. Karen stepped down from the HOA. Then the HOA itself dissolved, voted out of existence by the remaining members who realized they'd been complicit in a multi-year trespassing spree. The dock contract was canceled. The community area was cleared off my land. The community center temporarily closed, then reopened under a rental agreement I drafted myself. Because here's the thing, I didn't want revenge. I wanted order. So I offered a deal. Any neighbor who wanted to continue using the dock or common grounds could do so for a small monthly lease fee, less than what they were paying in HOA dues. In return, I would manage maintenance, protect the shoreline, and ensure no one ever tried to pull a Karen again. Most people agreed. Those who didn't moved out within a year. Karen. She sold her house at a loss and moved to Florida. Rumor had it, she joined another HOA and was already trying to ban inflatable pool toys. As for me, I finally renovated the cabin, restored the dock, planted native shrubs along the waterline, built a small outdoor office where my grandfather's old shed had stood. Sometimes Dorothy came over in the evening, and we'd sit on the porch, rods in hand, waiting for fish that never bit, laughing about battles that now felt like legend. I didn't win because I yelled louder. I won because I had records, because I understood the difference between power and authority. Because when someone tries to take what's yours, you don't just push back, you hold your ground. Literally, 1 month after the dust had settled, I found the last note from my grandfather tucked into an old field journal. It was written in pencil, half faded but still legible. If someone tries to take this land, fight smart, not angry, use the truth. And don't forget you're not just protecting property, you're protecting peace. I folded the page, slipped it back into the journal, and looked out at the lake. The water was calm again, just the way it should be.